Yo, Philly, how you's doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Kashatus, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. On this show, we will explore Philadelphia's old Negro League teams and some of the stars who played on them. More than any other city, Philadelphia was home to and supported black ball clubs whose successes inspired racial pride among the region's African Americans. Among those clubs were the Pythians, Giants, and Stars, as well as the Derby-based Hilldales and the Mid-Atlantic-based Cuban Giants, heavily comprised of Philadelphia amateur ball players. This week, I'm pleased to have as my guest Larry Lester, historian, author, and co-founder and research director of the Negro League Baseball Museum in Kansas City. Mr. Lester also co-chaired the National Baseball Hall of Fame's groundbreaking Out of the Shadows project, which unearthed considerable new data about Negro Leagues baseball. As the chairman of SABR's Negro Leagues Committee, Mr. Lester organizes the annual Jerry Malloy Conference. He has also written or co-written many of the seminal works about the Negro Leagues, including books about the East-West All-Star Game, Rube Foster, Black Baseball in Detroit, Kansas City, Chicago, and Pittsburgh, and Black Baseball's first World Series. Welcome to the show, Larry.
Thank you, Bill, for having me on your show, Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I appreciate your invite.
Let's begin with you. How did you become involved with Negro League Baseball? What inspired your interest?
Well, I grew up not too far from the old Municipal Stadium in Kansas City, right off of 22nd in Brooklyn. Grew up in a black neighborhood, went to an all-black school, attended an all-black church, and I would go to the Kansas City athletic games and see all these white guys on the playing field. Just kind of curious, I would walk back home and ask the elders in the neighborhood, where do all these white guys come from? And they would say, outside of our community. And I said, well, where are the black guys? And at that point, they would tell me about these players who played in the Negro Leagues. They would tell me these awesome stories about Cool Papa Bell, Satchel Paige, and Josh Gibson, and Bullet Rogan, and many others. And I listened. More story than factual. I couldn't find anything in the history books about them. But I enjoyed baseball, went to the game, kept score with a pencil and paper, and really enjoyed the game. And in 1970, while I was in college, Robert Peterson came out with the book, Only the Ball is White. Mm-hmm. And suddenly these stories that these men were telling me were true. These ball players actually existed, and I had attended school with Satchel Paige's children, so I knew them, but those stories were still more hyperbole, more mythical in nature, and suddenly it was like, wow, more research needs to be done. Mm-hmm. So I'm grateful and thankful for Robert Peterson's book, Only the Ball Was White. It set me off on a new journey that I'm still trying to complete.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, Kansas City is really the capital of Negro League Baseball. I say that with all humility. We have some phenomenal teams here in Philadelphia, but of course the Kansas City Monarchs are really the equivalent of the New York Yankees in African American baseball. And you have been instrumental in really bringing their story and the story of Negro League Baseball back. I mean, you're co-founder of the Negro League Baseball Museum, which had its origins in the 1990s. Who else was involved in the establishment of that museum, Larry?
Well, the museum idea came from a classmate by the name of Horace Peterson. Mm-hmm. He called me up one day. He was the executive director of the Black Archives of Mid-America, and he wanted to create a jazz and baseball museum. But he says, I don't know a lot about baseball, but I know that you do, Larry, so come to this meeting. The mayor was there, Dick Berkeley and Buck O'Neill, and the four of us got together and said, let's do this. We're going to have a jazz and a baseball museum at 18th and Vine. And from there, we formalized some business plans, some ideas, and how to get city funding, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how we just got started. It wasn't my idea. I just took the lead and pushed the agenda forward.
Now that museum has grown by leaps and bounds. During the 50th anniversary celebration of Jackie Robinson's breaking of the color barrier in 1997, the city raised $20 million to build a new American Jazz Museum and expanded the space for the Negro League Baseball Museum to 10,000 square feet, which is considerable. What will baseball fans find when they visit the museum?
Well, what baseball players will find, and fans and historians alike, will find a basic timeline from post-Civil War days up through the integration of Major League Baseball. What I did, I took photographs from my personal collection that I've been collecting over the years. They were blown up to museum size, and I wrote captions showing how the independent teams came along in the 1900s up through the 1920s when we had league teams, and 30s, 40s, until the integration of Major League Baseball, writing descriptive captions for each of the photographs. As you enter the museum, to the right is a team timeline, and it shows you how teams came and went in rapid fashion, especially during the depressional years, late 20s, early 30s. I did that in an Excel spreadsheet, and the designers turned it into this incredible graphic where you can see that in Cleveland they had maybe 30 teams from 1920 to 1950.
Wow.
You go to Kansas City, you see one team from 1920 to 1955.
Right.
And you can see the names of the teams would change. Like in your case, Philadelphia, we would show Hilldale from roughly 1923 to 1928, and then it was switched to the Philadelphia Tigers in 28, and from there back to the Hilldale for 29 and 31 until we eventually get to 1933 when the Philadelphia Stars, led by Ed Bowden, played until probably the mid-50s, around 1952. So you see this historical team timeline. So when visitors come from out of town, they can say, "Wow, these are the years that there was a black team in my respective city," and that's what we were trying to accomplish there.
Mm-hmm.
You will also see statues, and there's a database, a touchscreen database where you select the ball player's name and his biographical information pops up on the screen.
Mm-hmm. Now, I noted that you did not mention a Negro League Hall of Fame, and I noted that the museum is not called the Negro League's Baseball Hall of Fame. Does it have any official relationship with the National Baseball Hall of Fame at Cooperstown, New York?
No, it does not, Bill. In discussions and several meetings, we decided not to use the name Hall of Fame. We did not want to dilute the message brought out by Cooperstown. We did not want to have a black Hall of Fame versus competing against a counterpart white Hall of Fame. Mm-hmm. We felt like our mission was to try to bring forth an agenda and get these black ball players into the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. So there's only one Hall of Fame, a National Hall of Fame, and that's in Cooperstown. Mm-hmm. And so we left the name Hall of Fame off our incorporated name, the Negro League Baseball Museum. Now, that was the idea behind that. Of
course, the the National Baseball Hall of Fame at Cooperstown does have, over the years, has inducted 35 Negro Leaguers. In my estimation, that's far too few.
Okay.
And please humor me on this, because a lot of our listeners are the current generation, and they don't know much about the Negro Leagues or, who exactly is in the National Baseball Hall of Fame who are Negro Leaguers. And I know you know all this information, but nine of those Negro Leaguers, 9 of the 35, were selected between 1971 and 1977 by the Committee on Negro Baseball Leagues. Those inductees were Satchel Paige, Josh Gibson, Buck Leonard, Monty Irvin, Cool Papa Bell, Judy Johnson, Oscar Charleston, Pop Lloyd, and Martin DeHigo. After the special committee disbanded, its powers were shifted to the Veterans Committee, which elected Rube Foster in 1981 and Ray Dandridge in 1987. Between 1995 and 2001, the Veterans Committee was given a mandate to elect a Negro League player annually, and they elected 7 more players, including Leon Day, Bullet Joe Rogan, and Smokey Joe Williams. Finally, in 2006, another 17 Negro League players and executives were elected to the Hall of Fame by a second 12-member special committee from a pool of 39 candidates. You were on that committee, and I'm curious.
Yes.
With so many outstanding Negro League players and executives, how did the committee manage to reduce that pool to 30 of just 17 inductees? I mean, we know that Buck O'Neil is not in there. There's a special award named after him, but here's a man that deserves to be in there, and he's not in there.
Okay.
And I could think half a dozen others off the top of my head.
Well, it was an extended process. In the year 2000, the National Baseball Hall of Fame sent out a request for proposals to do a study of Negro League history. It was a $250,000 proposal, and my team beat out the Negro League Baseball Museum, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and other historical groups for this proposal. So with this money, we were able to closely examine newspaper accounts, gather oral interviews, and we had a ton of information over the next 4 or 5 years. With that information, we came up with a pool of 93 candidates, and from there, we had a team of 5 people. We met, I think, in Miami, Florida, someplace in Florida, and we took the 93 candidates, graded them A, B, and C, and came up with the final pool of 39 candidates. And I reached out to other historians to complete our committee of 12, added 7 more members, and the 12 people voted on these 39 candidates, and 17 of them were inducted. We used a tier process, tier 1, 2, and 3, to grade the ball players based on all this historical data that we had. Roughly, I had about 13,000 box scores that I manually inputted into an Access database to spit out statistical reports for each of these 93 candidates. And that was part of the book that we presented to each of the 12 voters, along with biographical information. Each of the 12 fellows and one lady wrote a bio on a particular ball player on this list of 93. And from there, we voted. Some were easy, very easy, like J.L. Wilkerson and Saul White and others, those are probably slam dunks. I don't know the voting results, of course, but I imagine those, we did not discuss those automatic inductees at length. We just, this is a no-brainer. Let's just vote, move on to the next candidate. So we had quite a few, mostly executives, that there was very little discussion about. And, of course, we saved the last two living members, Minnie Minoso and Buck O'Neill, for the last day of discussion, the third day.
By the way, none of the 35 Negro leaguers that are in the National Baseball Hall of Fame include players like Jackie Robinson, Roy Campanella, Hank Aaron, and Willie Mays, who also played in the Negro Leagues but later became huge stars in the major leagues. They were elected later on by the baseball writers, so it's important for listeners to understand that. I mean, we're talking about people, with the exception of a few like Monty Irvin, who also played in organized ball, but they were judged pretty much on their contributions to Negro League Baseball. I am of particular interest to me are three of those individuals, and you named two of them. Three of those individuals that were elected in 2006. They are Biz Mackey, a catcher for the Hilldales and Stars, and someone who mentored one of my all-time heroes, Roy Campanella, when he was with the Baltimore Elite Giants. Louis Santop, another catcher for the Hilldales, and the only woman in the National Baseball Hall of Fame, Effa Manley, a Philadelphia native and co-owner with her husband, Abe Manley, of the Brooklyn Eagles and later the Newark Eagles. I'm curious, Larry, was there any controversy among the committee members in the discussions about her candidacy, whether or not a woman should be elected to the Hall of Fame?
Well, I preface my answer by saying that the 12 people on this committee, including myself, knew a great deal about Effa Manley before we walked into that room.
Mm-hmm.
Her business files are at the Newark Public Library. Many of us have read those files. We had tracked her career as an executive for the Newark Eagles over the years. So I can say there was absolutely no problem with putting her in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. It was very little discussion about her. We knew that she had campaigned for equal rights and civil rights in Newark and in New York City. She had fought against Major League Baseball owners to honor contracts with the Eagles. She said, I will not give away Monty Irvin and Larry Doby. You will honor their contracts. She was put down by the black press as saying that you're trying to keep our black men from going into Major League Baseball. That's what we've been trying to do all these years, and now you're holding back. She stood her ground, and going forward, all the other Major League Baseball owners would pay Negro League teams for the right to negotiate with their ball players. So she was a force to be reckoned with, and we recognize that. Of course, I don't know the vote total, but I imagine it was overwhelming in her favor, probably a slam dunk. Being a woman was never considered. I mean, the fact that she was a woman was never considered. She was an executive who, when you talk to ball players who paid them on time, they were always well dressed. They had a really nice travel bus. She was a complete professional, and everything looked good. She just happened to be a woman.
She definitely. I've had many conversations with the late Monty Irvin about her, and she definitely did deserve to be. She does deserve to be in the Hall of Fame, despite the controversy about her concern over the breaking up, actually, of the Negro Leagues. And my understanding was it was, her choice to break the color barrier. It wasn't Jackie Robinson. It was Monty Irvin, who was widely considered the best ball player in the Negro Leagues in the 1940s. And when you talk to Monty, or when I would talk to Monty about that, he'd say, very humbly, a tremendously humble man, well, I don't know about that. Jackie Robinson had the fortitude and the resolve, and I don't know if I could have, done what he did. He said, I would have done it differently, but, it turns out that he was the right person in the right time for that. Another person, Monty Irvin, by the way, who is a Hall of Famer as a person and a ball player in my book. Now, I don't want to belabor this point, but as I mentioned, I do think that there are too few Negro Leaguers in the Hall of Fame. And after the 2006 election, initially, the Hall of Fame permanently closed the door on Negro League inductions. But then last July, that is July of 2016, after it was brought to the attention, just this last July of 2017, after it was brought to the attention of the Hall's board of directors that white players and executives as far back as the 19th century have remained eligible for consideration, the Hall very quietly made Negro Leaguers eligible again. However, there's still a catch. Negro Leaguers and others from baseball history who made their most significant contribution before 1950 can be considered just once every 10 years. Now, since Negro Leaguers haven't been honored by Cooperstown at anywhere near the same level as white players, how, in your estimation, can the Hall of Fame correct this situation?
The only solution is to have the Negro Leaguers on a ballot every year.
Mm-hmm.
Give us an opportunity to present new cases. Despite the study that we did from 2000 to 2005, we have discovered new information on other ball players such as John Donaldson and Cannonball Dick Redding, Rap Dixon, and others. We would like for them to receive consideration as we revisit that time in history. Basically, the door to Negro League players being put into the Hall of Fame is closed. Based on the current rules and guidelines. It just won't happen, Bill. It just won't happen.
Yeah, I am right now at loggerheads with that institution over Dick Allen, and I'm part of a campaign that is very vigorously promoting just putting his name on the ballot again before 2020. Not many people really understand that in Dick's case, Dick, would be actually, if he's elected, the first African American player, not a Negro Leaguer, to be elected by the Veterans Committee. And that's just aside from the fact that the man deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. But that's another story.
I completely agree. I completely agree. I'm sorry. I watched him play growing up. He's a Hall of Famer.
Yep.
Best of the best.
Well, you're right. We'll find out at the end of the World Series if his name's on that ballot, and I know there are going to be a lot of very upset people in Philly and elsewhere if it's not. Let's turn to Philadelphia because we've already talked. You've mentioned a number of prominent Philadelphia Negro Leaguers and teams. The first all-black team surfaced in the city during the 1860s, and the most prominent of these amateur clubs were the Pythians, and they were founded by Octavius Catto, an early civil rights leader who led the struggle to desegregate Philadelphia streetcars. Catto, who was assassinated in 1871, was the club's second baseman. And by the way, Philadelphia just recently erected, finally, a statue of him in the City Hall courtyard to honor his many contributions. What can you tell us about the Pythians and specifically about Cato's baseball career?
Cato was a fairly good ball player. He played shortstop and second base. Usually batted second in the lineup, which tells me he was probably a weak hitter. The team itself, the Pythians, was mostly comprised of, I would say, affluent African Americans and mulattoes, educated mulattoes, and Pythians were what I would consider a professional team. The scorecards for their games can be found at the Free Library in Philadelphia, which I have examined and put into my database. And Cato and another fellow by the name of Jacob White Jr. were the founders of the team. And a lot of detailed information can be found in that great book called Tasting Freedom by Dr. Daniel Biddle and Murray Dubin.
Good book.
Great book. But the Pythian records are available, and I'm thankful that they are a part of history right after the Civil War. And, of course, they folded after the assassination of Cato in 1871 and did not fully rejuvenate after his death. So.
One of the things that have been a little confusing to me, and then, on second thoughts, rather obvious to me, the Pythians, as you say, were instrumental in promoting baseball coming out of the Civil War. They played against many white opponents, and logically they tried to affiliate itself with the National Association of Baseball Players. Now, since the so-called gentleman's agreement barring blacks from the white professional leagues did not begin until the mid-1880s, why was their application rejected? Or was this something that was just building in the 1870s, that this gentleman's agreement essentially already existed?
Well, the application was rejected based solely on race.
Right.
The actual wording is very much akin to what we see in today's politics. When they were denied the application, and you can find this at the Free Library, it stated if colored clubs were admitted, there would be in all probability some division of feelings, whereas by excluding them, no injury would result to anyone. And so these such declarations were the beginnings of the unwritten but widely accepted gentleman's agreement. Wow. And you can see the political spin on it in that we really want to have you in our league, but you may cause the fans to fight over racial animosity or whatever, and we don't want anything to happen, so why don't you just stay away?
Wow. So, in other words, there were groups like the Pythians because of their success, not just really their race, really caused these white owners and the white National Association of Baseball Players to start the gentleman's agreement.
Right. They felt like, hey, white fans would not come to see a black team, or white fans would not be acceptable. You've heard all the stories, Bill. The white man will lose his job at first base because of a black athlete.
Right.
We don't want that to happen. They're taking away our jobs, our entertainment, our sport, our national pastime, and we don't want that. We like them. They're good people, but this is our sport.
Now, I want to ask you about the Cuban Giants. Their players spoke a mock Spanish so they could pass as Cuban. And you see these fascinating stories throughout Major League Baseball. For example, we know that John McGraw of the New York Giants wanted to sign a black player, and he tried to pass him off as Indian and called him Chief Knockahoma.
Right.
This just did not work. And most of these players from the Cuban Giants were from Philadelphia.
Right.
So what was going on there with the Cuban part of that?
Well, you have to remember, a lot of teams, they claim the fans did not want to see an all African American team, so they would accept them if they were Cuban. But the Cuban Giants team, they had players like Boyd, Dabney, Day, Eagleson, Harris, Holmes, Martin, Nicholson, and Randolph. Not a single Spanish surname was on the roster. Mm-hmm. But see, the owner of the team knew that America would not accept a team composed entirely of African Americans. And, these adversities only dampened the wishful expectations of black players whose slim hopes were often prefaced by the dubious compliment, if you were only white, you could play on our team. This goes back to the Philadelphia Pythians and their rejection of their application. We'd love to have you if you were not black. Pretty weak excuse, but as you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Now, I'm glad. No, you're absolutely right to that. I'm glad you mentioned the issue of popularity and when Negro League Baseball became popular among whites, because the Philadelphia Giants, I think, had a lot to do with that. They were the so-called first of the city's professional black ball clubs because they were paid, and they were established in 1902. Their home games were played at Columbia Park, which was the home ballpark of the Philadelphia Athletics, and it was located at 29th and Columbia Streets. The Giants built a championship dynasty between 1904 and 1908, winning 5 titles in the World Colored Association, and tied the Leland Giants at 3 games each in the first black professional championship sponsored by the National Association of Colored Baseball Clubs of the United States and Cuba. And those Giants teams had some phenomenal players. We already talked about Saul White, who was the manager and shortstop. He would also write the very first history of Negro League Baseball. There was second baseman Frank Grant and ace pitcher Rube Foster. These were some of the greatest stars in the early days of Negro League ball, the equivalent, as I said, of what the New York Yankees of the major leagues would become in the 20s and 30s. Now, this turned a lot of heads in Philadelphia, but obviously quite not enough white heads because, it wasn't really until the 30s and 40s where whites started to attend Negro League Baseball games, and not just in Philadelphia. Well, why did it take that long? I mean, the Negro League Baseball was much more exciting. It was known for the hit and run. It was known for the steal, the basket catch. You name it. This was much more exciting than the kind of slow, plodding, organized baseball that whites played. Why did it take so long?
Well, like you said, the whites played station-to-station baseball because they were waiting on the home run. I don't know the complete answer, but the Philadelphia Giants teams, they had to be awesome. I mean, that was the premier team of the period. I mean, we mentioned Charlie Grant earlier trying to pass as Chief Knockahoma. He was on that team. And Pete Hill, he was in the Hall of Fame. Pop Lloyd, Hall of Famer, was on that team. Home Run Johnson. Danny McClellan, who pitched a no-hitter, I think in 1902, the first recorded no-hitter by African-American. Spots Pose, who should be in the Hall of Fame. Cannonball Dick Redding, a great pitcher. Bruce Petway, who threw out Ty Cobb 2 or 3 times in the Cuban game around that period, 1909, 1910. I don't know the answer, but I think the few fans that went to see the Philadelphia Giants play, they said, man, have you seen that great shortstop Pop Lloyd and that outfielder Pete Hill? You might just want to check them out. And pretty soon the white fan base started to grow because, like you said, they wanted to see a more up-tempo type of baseball, running and tricky baseball, bunt and run, double steals and basket catches, and oh man, the game just came alive with fire and desire, with a lot of wit and will and skill. That was the epitome of black baseball during that period.
Mm-hmm. Now, the demise of the Giants mirrors those of many Negro League teams. It began with the defection of its star players to other teams after the 1909 season, and the team was forced to disband midway through the 1911 season. And the Giants weren't the only great team to suffer that fate. Why did that happen? I mean, was it poor management, greedy owners, limited finances? Why did you have so many of these teams fold?
Well, I don't have the complete answer, but I think it was just a power struggle among the power brokers. I think the Eagles got in the way, and they wanted to have the best talent in black America. And these ball players like Papa Lloyd and Pete Hill and Cannonball Dick Redding and Spots Pose went where the money was.
Yep.
They were paid basically in those days from game to game. Mm-hmm. Very loosely written contracts. So if you got rained out, you didn't get paid that day. Mm-hmm. But I think it was more of a power struggle, and Ruth Foster, with his big ego, raided some teams.
Right.
And eventually they became the Chicago American Giants, and all these great ball players migrated to other wonderful teams.
I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my favorite Negro League team, who were the Hilldale Daisies.
Okay.
Originally a group of black teens who played in an open field in Darby, just southwest of Philadelphia. Yeah. They were transformed into a professional powerhouse by Ed Bolden, who was a postal worker who began as the team's scorer and later became their manager. The Hilldales won the first three Eastern Colored League pennants beginning in 1923, and in 1925 they won the second Colored World Series. Hall of Fame third baseman Judy Johnson was a Hilldale regular for most of its glory days. Oscar Charleston, Biz Mackey, and Louis Santop, all Hall of Famers, were also important Hilldale regulars in the 1920s. Now, I hate to say this, but I do believe that when the Hilldales won the 1925 Colored World Series, it was against the Kansas City Monarchs, was it not?
I don't think I remember that year.
Oh, yeah. That's convenient memory loss.
I think we beat them the year before.
You did. You did. I think that team is undoubtedly my favorite, and I have a bias. It's because I had the opportunity to meet Judy Johnson before he passed, and I just thought the two Negro Leaguers who I just adored were Judy Johnson and Gene Benson, who I got to know better. Gene Benson, as you know, mentored Jackie Robinson before he went to Montreal. And speaking of Robinson, many Negro Leaguers consider Jackie Robinson's breaking of the color barrier a mixed blessing. While it opened the door to organized baseball for African Americans, it also spelled the death of the Negro Leagues. At least that's what many historians write. But is that really true? I mean, for example, not every Negro Leaguer made it to the majors, and certainly there were many major league clubs like the Yankees, Phillies, and Red Sox that simply refused to integrate for more than a decade after Robinson broke the barrier. Wasn't there enough talent in the Negro Leagues to continue as a kind of alternative farm system to the white majors in the 1950s and maybe even in the 60s?
Oh, most definitely. The talent was there. It varied a great deal.
Right.
It's very difficult to say, but there was a lot of talent in the Negro Leagues. And despite what you read, Bill, we have to be fair. When I do statistical analysis, I find as many Negro League players below the Mendoza line as I do white ball players. if a certain year I see Major League Baseball batting an average of 230, I see that same result team-wise across the Negro Leagues.
Really?
My point is everybody in the Negro Leagues was not great, but they were very good. It's basically the Major League Baseball took the cream of the crop and gutted the golden goose as she laid her eggs, and that's what caused the demise of the Negro Leagues. They had talent from A to Z, unlike what you read in some books that everybody in the Negro Leagues was great. That just wasn't the case. But they definitely had enough talent for a couple of farm clubs, and black newspaper writers tried to lobby that, but did not work. And basically killed the league, to my disappointment. But kind of like Walmart comes into a small town, and all the mom and pop stores have to go.
Yeah. One of the discouraging things for me today, being involved in amateur baseball and in a city like Philadelphia, I don't see, even with the establishment of the Reviving Baseball in the Inner Cities programs, we just don't see the number of African American kids playing the game as much as they did years ago. I mean, if you look at the major leagues and the farm systems, we're seeing the Latin Americanization of baseball right now. And the number of blacks that are going into baseball has dropped rather considerably over the last decade and a half. To what do you attribute that?
I contribute that to more options for African American athletes. They have other venues like the NBA, NFL, soccer, track and field, which is now professional. I do not see the percentage of African Americans ever increasing in Major League Baseball again.
Wow.
I disappointingly say that. It's an opportunity for people of all sizes, like Jose Altuve has presented to us that anybody can play this game regardless of size. But I'm also seeing a trend in Cuban baseball that no one's talking about. The young people who are coming up are starting to play soccer and not baseball.
Interesting.
National. Yeah, because like basketball, you don't need a teammate. You can play with the soccer ball. You can play with the basketball by yourself to increase your skills.
That's right.
You don't have to worry about playing against an opponent or forming a team. When you have some downtime, you can dribble that soccer ball or basketball and increase your skills. So I think we will see the Latin American talent maximized as far as numbers into Major League Baseball at some point as more of the young Cuban and Latin American ball players take up the game of soccer.
That's, my second sport is soccer. I coached it. I played it all the way through college. And you're absolutely correct. I see more black athletes going into soccer, and definitely Latinos playing soccer. And my hope has always been growing up that the concussions that are going on in football and it quickly is discouraging a lot of parents from sending their kids to play that sport, and that soccer would finally arrive. Well, the 70s were supposed to be the sport for soccer. Never happened. The 80s never happened. And now what we've seen is that soccer has gone real big in the amateur ranks and even through the college level, but it still is not catching on at the professional level in our country. So, who knows? But I'll tell you what, soccer is a distant second for me. Nothing compares to baseball. I mean, I can coach it. I once played it. That's the sport. That's the sport.
It's the greatest sport on earth. I call it the chess game in motion. There's something going on with every pitch. So
you're right. Actually, that's a great metaphor. That's a great metaphor. Well, Larry, thank you for being with us. I mean, that was wonderful, wonderful discussion. I really do appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me, Bill, on your show. We'll do it again as time allows.
Absolutely. And thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia baseball, past, present, and personal. This is Bill Kashatus, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.